Great to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Wait a minute, skipped up. Bella in Florida, Shandor in the Bronx, Stephen in New Hampshire, Sharon in New Jersey, Melissa in Great Neck, Spencer in Connecticut, Elon in Silver Spring. Welcome, everybody. Let's get busy. Not a very short daf, but manageable. We pick this up at the bottom of page 100b, or near the bottom, with Mishna number 5 here in Tractate Bava, in chapter 8 of Tractate Bava Metzia. Mishnah 5. In the case of one who sells his olive trees to another, so that he can chop them down and use them for their wood. Very interesting. I want trees removed from my land, but they're going to be worth something as firewood, so I'm actually going to sell them to a guy who's going to come, chop them down and remove the wood, but then he's going to get that wood. Okay, sounds good. So I sell him olive trees so he can chop them down and use them for wood. And before he chopped them down, they yielded olives. So I sold him my trees, even though they're on my land. And before he actually comes and chops them down, they yielded olives. So now we have a very interesting distinction. If the olives are of a quality that could provide the value of less than a quarter lug of oil per sa of olives, these olives are the property of the new owner of the olive trees, i.e. the buyer. In other words, these are low quality olives. You wouldn't really care about them. So whoever bought the trees gets the olives. But if these trees yielded olives that could provide the value of a quarter lug or more of oil per sa, that's a volume, of olives, and this one, the buyer says, well, my olive trees yielded the olives, right? He bought the trees, so I have a right to them, meaning the olives. And that one, meaning the seller, says, well, it was the nourishment from my land that yielded the olives, and so I have a right to the olives. Then they divide the value of the olives between them. Now, a crazy hypothetical. In the event that a river swept away one's olive trees and deposited them in the field of another person, and the olive trees took root in that field after having been swept there and yielded olives. So now this one, the owner of the trees, says, my olive trees yielded the olives, so I have a right to them. And that one, the owner of the field where the flooding river, deposited the trees and then they took root, he says, well, it's the nourishment from my land that yielded the olives, and so I have a right to them. Then they divide the olives between them. And this crazy hypothetical, I think, is meant just to provide that counter distinction where before we said the seller, it was his land that nourished the trees and produced the olives before he, sold the trees to the guy who would chop them down for wood. And so this is the opposite, right? Where it was my original land that nourished the trees. Then the trees were swept away. They landed somewhere else. So now the trees are in somebody else's land, but it was my land that originally sustained them, and produced the nourishment that actually now leads to these olives. And so since we both have this argument, we end up splitting the value. That's Mishnah number 5. Now the Gemara. Then the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of the sale, right? So now I'm selling my trees to a guy who's going to chop them down for wood. So if this is a case where before the sale, the seller said to the buyer, cut down the trees immediately. Well, then clearly he is particular that the buyer not derive benefit from the nourishment provided by his land. He doesn't want the trees there anymore. He wants them cut down now. Therefore, even if the olives yielded could provide less than the value of a quarter lug of oil per sa of olives, meaning they're low quality olives, they will still belong to the owner of the land, i.e. the seller. Conversely, if the case is where the seller said to the buyer, cut down the trees whenever you want, well, then it is clear that he is not particular about the buyer deriving benefit from the nourishment provided by his land. Therefore, even if the olives yielded could provide the value of a quarter lug or more per sa of olives, meaning high quality olives, they will belong to the owner of the olive trees, meaning the one who bought the olive trees. He bought them to cut them down for firewood, but now he gets this bonus of a bunch of olives that come with them. And the Gemara explains that this was necessary to say in a case where the seller said to the buyer to cut down the trees without specifying about when he should do so. Accordingly, he didn't say cut it down whenever you want, and he didn't say cut it down right away. He just didn't say. So accordingly, if the olives yielded produce less than the value of a quarter lug per sa, then since people are generally not particular to receive their share of such low quality olives, the buyer may keep them. But the buyer of the trees who bought them for firewood. But where the olives yielded produce of higher quality olives that yield more oil, people are generally particular to receive their share of those kinds of olives, and consequently the seller and the buyer split the value of those olives that were a bonus to the one who bought the trees for firewood. Now Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi says, and the value of the quarter lug is exclusive of the expense of processing the olives to produce oil. Now we're on page 101a. And the Mishna teaches, in the event that a river swept away one's olive trees and deposited them in the field of another person, and they took root there, and they yielded olives. So then the olives are divided between the owner of the trees and the owner of the field. Ula says that Reish Lakish says, they taught this only about a case where the olive trees were uprooted and relocated together with their clods of earth in which they grew. It's like they came along with the earth that was surrounding their root ball, and you'll see in a moment why that's important. And the ruling is with regard to olives that grew after 3 years. This is the prohibition of Orla. Since the trees took root in the new field. After 3 years, there is no longer any prohibition of Orla on the olives, even if one presumes that the olives were nourished from the field owner's land. See, what's going on here is when you plant a fruit tree, we have the prohibition on eating its fruit for the first 3 years after it's planted. Now, that doesn't mean that the tree was a new tree, a sapling, when it was planted. It could be that it was a fairly mature tree, but when they uprooted it, they let all the earth fall off it, right? And then they planted it in a new field, so now we start the clock again. On the other hand, if you took the tree with its earth, right, then the tree is as old as it was in the first location because you took the earth with it. And so if the earth came with it and it ends up taking root in this new field, then it's not considered in its first 3 years and the fruit will be available. Whereas if it didn't come with its dirt and it took root in the field, then it would be a new planting and no one can benefit from that fruit, or at least not the owner of the field in which it's planted, for those first 3 years. So what happens? But during the first 3 years, after the trees took root in the new field, right, after having been swept there by a flood, everything that grows is the property of the owner of the olive trees, meaning the original owner before the flood swept them away. As he can say to the owner of the field in which they ended up and took root, even if you had planted the trees yourself at the time that they took root in your field, would you have eaten the olives during the first 3 years? No, because they'd be prohibited by Orla. If you claim that the nourishment from your land yielded the olives, well, then the olives would be prohibited as Orla. The only reason for them to be permitted is if it is assumed that they were nourished only from the clods of earth in which they were initially planted over 3 years ago in my field, in which case they should belong entirely to me. as the owner of both the trees and the clods of dirt that went along with them when the flood carried them away. And the Gemara asks, but let the owner of the field, where the trees ended up after the flood, say to the original owner of the trees, if I had uprooted your trees from my field when they landed there, and instead planted my own trees, well then after 3 years, I could have consumed all of the olives yielded by them. Now that I let your trees remain, and so you have a right to consume half with me, in return, I should be entitled to half the yield during the first 3 years as well. And the Gemara suggests another interpretation. Rather, when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, he said in the name of Reish Lakish, they taught this only about a case where the olive trees were uprooted and relocated together with their clods of earth in which they grew. And the ruling is with regard to olives that grew during the first 3 years, since the trees took root in the new field. But after the first 3 years, everything that grows is the property of the owner of the land. As he can say to the owner of the trees, if I had uprooted your trees from my field and instead planted my own trees, then after 3 years, could I not have consumed all the olives produced by them? Even if there's going to be something owed to the original owner of the trees, after 3 years, that's over. Now the Gemara asked, but let the owner of the trees say to him, even if you had planted trees yourself at the time my trees took root in your field, then during the first 3 years you would not have consumed their fruit at all. How then can you come now and claim you are entitled to consume half of the olives together with me during those first 3 years? And the Gemara answers he has a right to demand half of the olives due to the fact that the owner of the field can say to the owner of the trees, if I had uprooted your trees from my field and instead planted my own trees, they would be slender plants that do not cast heavy shadows, and I would have planted chard and vegetables underneath the trees and made a significant profit. Since instead I let your trees remain, in return I should be entitled to half of the fruit during the first 3 years. Very interesting, the competing claims that they can make to justify what they get. And, bottom line, in this weird case where the trees were swept away by a flood along with the dirt surrounding their root ball, ended up in somebody else's field and took root there, it would appear that for 3 years, the owner of the trees, if he could, identify where his trees ended up, that's a big if, but if he could do that, then he and the owner of the field will split the profits of the fruit that comes from those trees. Now you might ask, if he found the trees that were swept away and took root in somebody else's land, couldn't he go there and pick up his trees and bring them back to his own land? Stay tuned. The sages taught in a baraisa, if the other one, the owner of the trees, said, I am uprooting and taking my olive trees back, the court does not listen to him. What is the reason? Rabbi Yochanan said, due to the desire to promote the settling of the land of Israel, it is inappropriate to uproot trees. Upon hearing this ruling, Rabbi Yirmiyah said, for rulings such as this, it is necessary to have a great sage explain it, as that reason is not self-evident. Right? Very interesting. So even though at the time that the sages are issuing rulings, what is the Talmudic period, right? The period of the Mishna is late Second Temple, so maybe starting around between 200 and 100 BC, maybe even a little later than that, up until about 200 CE, right? So that's when the Mishnah was redacted and set down. And then the sages of the Gemara, the Amoraim, they are issuing rulings from about 200 CE to about 500 CE. Now, why is this relevant? By the time, late Second Temple period, okay, so, the Jews had been in the land of Israel for a long time. I mean, the end of the Second Temple was destroyed in the year 70 CE. And by then, between the first temple, the second temple, and the tabernacle that stood in Israel for 400 years after Joshua led the children of Israel into Israel, so it's a total of about 1,300 years, that Jews had been in the land of Israel, sovereign over the land for the first 800, maybe 700 years or so. Let's say the first 800 years. Then conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, Babylonian exile, and then they return, but now it's kind of at the will of the Persian Empire, and then later at the will of the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. But they were there for a long time. Jews living in the land for a long time, well over 1,000 years. Then when you have the Roman wars, toward the end of the Second Temple period, which culminates in the Second Temple being destroyed, and then further wars after that, culminating in the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the year 135. So then terrible, absolute genocide of the Jews, maybe 1 million Jews killed in that war. And the Romans come and salt the earth, right? They're going to make it almost unmanageable for Jews to farm and grow produce in the land of Israel, because the Jews had been such a thorn in the side. Judea had been such a thorn in the side of the Roman Empire, with their continuous revolts and rebellions trying to break away. And it was, by the way, at this time that Rome renames Judea and calls it Palestina as an insult to the Jews, naming the land with the Roman version of Philistia, or the Philistines. But they had been gone from the land. That was a civilization that had disappeared for probably 600 or 700 years at that point. There were no Philistines at that time, and the Romans called it Palestine only because they were so angry at the Jews and did this as an insult. It's not because there were any Palestinians at that time. In fact, the word Palestinian meant Jew for many centuries after this. Okay, so just something that's good to remember. Now, my point being that the sages now, here in the Gemara, so let's say in the period between 200 and 500, talking about this mitzvah of settling the land. Right, and you can see, the challenge of this and what kind of hardy stock it took for people to be in Israel and to farm the land and to try to make it productive in the wake of these terrible difficulties, these terrible years of the Roman rebellions and the Romans squashing the Jews and killing sages, and the story of the 10 martyrs that included Rabbi Akiva. And salting the earth, etc. A very, very difficult time. And it's in that context, right, that they say that we don't listen to him about uprooting trees in the land of Israel, because the sages desire to promote the settling of the land of Israel. That's kind of like a visionary, aspirational, and beautiful desire at such a difficult time. Now, we learned in the Mishna there, Tractate Demai 6.2, that Rabbi Yehuda says that one who receives a field of his ancestors from a Gentile under a sharecropping agreement, meaning he is granted the right to cultivate the land and keep its produce in return for giving a portion of the produce to the Gentile owner, he must first tithe the produce grown in that field and only then give the Gentile his portion from among the tithed produce. Now, we're going to make a distinction between a sharecropper and a tenant farmer. And the difference is that a tenant farmer pays rent. He has an absolute amount of rent that he needs to pay. And then he can keep whatever comes from that land. The sharecropper farms the land, and whatever the land produces, he gives a percentage of that to the land's owner, right? So subtle difference, but an important difference. So here, Rabbi Yehuda says that one who receives a field of his ancestors from a Gentile. So what does that mean? Either it's going to mean that he is going to be a sharecropper on land within Israel that is owned by a Gentile, What does it mean, his ancestors? It means that his ancestors, the Jews, owned it when the Jews had sovereignty over the land of Israel, as opposed to this period when the Romans do. Or we're talking about a Jew who at some point his family lost that field and now it's owned by a Gentile, and he comes back and he's able to farm the field as a sharecropper, but he's working for a Gentile that owns his family's field. It was really his family's field, not just generally owned by the Jews, but his specific family owned that field. Now it's owned by a Gentile, and he is sharecropping that land. And so what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is that he's going to have to tithe that. Now, normally, even land within the land of Israel, even when Jews have sovereignty over it, if it somehow ends up being owned by a Gentile, there's no tithing requirement because Gentiles are not obligated in the mitzvah that's inherent, the commandment to Jews that they tithe from their land. And so then the question becomes, well, if the Gentile owns it, but the Jew is farming it, does the Jew have to tithe? And there's a dispute about that. One view says no, the other view says yes. So Rabbi Yehuda says yes. It's his land. It's his family's land. It's not currently owned by a Gentile, but since now the Jew is back and sharecropping it, so he has an interest in the land, he has to tithe it, and it's from the tithed produce that he gives his share, the percentage share that he has to give to the Gentile owner. And by the way, as colorful and crazy as that whole arrangement sounds, we had a good friend of blessed memory, Metzia Koidanovich, he was a Jewish guy, I'm pretty sure. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm wrong about that. I think Metzia was not Jewish. But anyway, his family were nobility in Yugoslavia, one of those Yugoslavian countries, I forget which, Croatia, Bosnia, I'm not sure which. But they were nobility. So his father's father's father was a count, it was the count of that fief, that landmass in that area. And then that fell under the Soviet Empire. And so Metzia ended up growing up in the castle that belonged to his family for many centuries, but under the Soviets, just became a place where they, had hundreds of people living there, and Metzia and his family, had no more, rights or privileges in that castle than the other hundreds of residents who were being housed there under the Soviet Empire. So pretty interesting way to grow up, right? It's your family's castle, but you're just, a tenant like everybody else of the Soviet state. At any rate, initially, when the sages studied this Mishnah, they assumed the following interpretation. What is the meaning of a field of his ancestors? It is a reference to any field in the land of Israel. And why do they call it a field of his ancestors? Because it is a field of his forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right? Any Jew, his ancestors are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. By the way, even if you're a convert, your ancestor is Abraham, right? Because when somebody converts to Judaism, their Hebrew name is whatever they choose, the son of or the daughter of Abraham and Sarah. And we have a teaching elsewhere that one who converts, it's because his soul was present at Mount Sinai, somehow got lost among the nations and found his way back. And that's why he's a son or daughter of Abraham and Sarah. According to this interpretation, now about the ancestral field that this guy ends up sharecropping, according to this interpretation, the Mishnah is referring to a field which was legitimately acquired by the Gentile. He bought it, and to which the Jew has no claim. So the Gemara explains why the Jewish sharecropper is required to tithe the produce that he will give the landowner. And the reason is that the Tana of this Mishnah holds that a Gentile's acquisition of land in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, does not abrogate the sanctity of the land with regard to separating tithes from its produce. Now, while the Gentile owns it and is farming it, he doesn't have to tithe. He's not obligated that way. But if the land comes back into the possession of a Jew, then the fact that it was owned by a Gentile for some amount of time does not cancel the fact that it needs to be tithed when it returns to Jewish ownership. Now the question is, what about sharecropping? Is that enough of an interest? Well, Rabbi Yehuda says yes. And Rabbi Yehuda also holds that the obligation of one who receives a field of his ancestors, meaning a sharecropper, to pay the landowner is like that of a tenant farmer, right? Remember, tenant farmer pays rent and then gets everything that comes out of the land. Sharecropper just farms the land and gives a percentage of what he produces to the owner. Slightly different arrangement. So Rabbi Yehuda says that the sharecropper, his arrangement is like that of a tenant farmer, i.e. just as a tenant farmer, whether the field produces a crop or whether it does not produce a crop, he's still required to pay rent. And what is the form of his rent? Well, he gives produce as rent, and if his land doesn't produce, then he's going to have to go get that produce somewhere else in order to pay the owner the rent that he owes. He's required to procure produce from somewhere else and tithe it, and then give it to the landowner, as he is like one paying his debt. And so too, one who receives, meaning a sharecropper, is also like one paying his debt, and he must consequently first tithe the produce and then give it to the landowner. And since his obligation to the landowner is regarded as a debt, apparently, before the produce is given to the landowner, it belongs to the tenant farmer or the sharecropper in the view of Rabbi Yehuda, and that's why he is required to tithe it. It's like his produce, his land, therefore he has to tithe it before he pays rent on the land, right? It's in his possession. So Rav Kahana said to Rav Papi, and some say that he said to Rav Zevid, but this explanation is challenged by that which is taught in a Baraisa. In the Baraisa, Rabbi Yehuda says that one who receives a field of his ancestors under a sharecropping agreement from a gentile oppressor who seized it, right? So now, first we said a gentile who legitimately bought the land. Now we're talking to like a gentile oppressor, like a Roman soldier who just came, evicted the Jewish resident, and then took it as his own. And you want to take it away from me? Let's fight, right? And what could you do with this Roman soldier who's backed up by a legion of other Roman soldiers? So the oppressor took the field. Right, so Rabbi Yehuda says that one who receives a field of his ancestors under a sharecropping agreement from a Gentile oppressor who seized it, first tithes the produce and then gives the Gentile his portion. According to the sage's initial understanding, why does the Baraisa specifically refer to an oppressor who stole the land? Even if the Gentile was not an oppressor, the ruling of the Baraisa would also apply. Rather, the Tan of the Mishna holds that a Gentile's acquisition of land in Eretz Yisrael abrogates its sanctity with regard to separating tithes from its produce, and he also holds that the obligation of one who receives, meaning a sharecropper, to pay the landowner is not like that of a tenant farmer. Since under the sharecropping arrangement, the landowner retains a percentage stake in the yield when the sharecropper provides the landowner with a portion of the produce, he is not considered to be paying a debt to him, but simply to be providing the landowner with the latter's own produce. In other words, they are partners, not a borrower lender. Therefore, fundamentally, the sharecropper should not have to tithe the produce before giving it to the landowner. And the requirement that he do so is not because he's paying rent, but rather it's a penalty that the sages imposed upon him, as the Gemara will explain. And according to this explanation, what is the meaning of a field of his ancestors? So it is referring to a field that belonged to his actual ancestors, of whom he is their heir, and it was then seized by a Gentile. And it is only him whom the sages penalized and required to take tithes from produce before giving it to the Gentile oppressor. Right? Isn't this terrible? First, the poor guy lost the land because a Gentile, figure a Roman soldier, seized it. And now he's getting penalized that he has to be tithed when he sharecrops it, which he wouldn't be if it wasn't this situation. So why would the sages penalize him in this way? And here's the explanation. Since the land is dear to him, because it's his family's land, he will more readily go and receive it in a sharecropping arrangement from the Gentile, despite the sage's tithing requirement. But with regard to another person of the world at large, the sages did not penalize him, as no one else would be willing to receive the land under such disadvantageous terms. Okay, but you're only penalizing the one who received this land to sharecrop that was originally land of his family's, but you wouldn't penalize some other Jew who went in and started sharecropping this land. Again, why are you penalizing him? It wasn't his fault that the Gentile oppressor seized the land from him. And the answer is, as we'll see, because this guy is attached to the land and it is dear to him, what the sages are saying is, you got to find a way to buy that land back. Even though it should be yours and you shouldn't have to purchase it back, find a way to get it back so that you won't be, tithing as you're sharecropping. Rather, you'll be tithing because you own the land, right? Be patient, hang in there. Eventually, this oppressor is going to be yanked off the land because the land will not tolerate these oppressors of the Jews in the land. And it's true, eventually the Romans were forced out of the land. And this explains why the sages limited the fine to a person who has an ancestral claim to this field. But what is the reason that the sages penalized him? Rabbi Yochanan says it was in order to encourage him to purchase the field, so that it will be clearly in his possession. The disadvantageous conditions will make it preferable for him to purchase the land outright from the Gentile instead of entering into a sharecropping arrangement with him. Upon hearing this ruling, Rabbi Yirmiyah said, for rulings such as this, it is necessary to have a great sage explain it, because it's just not intuitive at all. An Amoraic dispute, a dispute of the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, was stated with regard to one who entered another's field and planted trees in it without the permission of the owner of the field. Since the owner of the field profits from the planter's actions, he is required to pay him. And Rav says the court appraises both the expenses for the one who planted the trees and the value of the improvements, and the planter is at a disadvantage, i.e. the owner of the field pays the lesser of the two amounts. And Shmuel says the court estimates how much a person would be willing to give for someone to plant trees in this field, and that is how much the owner of the field must pay. So I think what we're talking about here is somebody who thought that the land belonged to nobody, absentee owner. So he plants some trees and he starts growing produce there. And then after some years, the owner shows up and says, well, thanks for planting some trees. This is my land. Goodbye. So the guy who planted the trees, who did all this work and has now left productive trees on the land, the sages said he is entitled to something. He can't keep the land. There's no squatter's rights here, but he is going to be compensated for the manner in which he improved the land. But since he did so without the owner's agreement or permission, it's not like he's going to get paid a lot. And Rav Papa said, and Rav and Shmuel do not disagree. Here, Shmuel's ruling is with regard to a field that is designated for planting, while there, Rav's ruling is with regard to a field that is not designated for planting. And the Gemara notes, in this ruling of Rav was not stated explicitly, rather it was stated implicitly. As there was a certain person, here comes an incident, who came before Rav after someone had planted trees in that person's field. And Rav said to him, go and have the court appraise both the expenses for the one who planted the trees and the value of the improvements. And the owner of the field said to him, I do not want these trees. Why should I pay for them? And Rav said to him, go and have the court appraise both the expenses for the one who planted the trees and the value of the improvements. And he is at a disadvantage, meaning you are obligated to pay him only the lesser of the two amounts. And the owner of the field said to him, I don't want the trees. Why should I pay for them? Rav did not persist with his ruling, indicating that he conceded that the owner of the field was not obligated to pay since he didn't want the trees. Right? If he accepted that to have the trees was an advantage, then he would have to pay. But if he really doesn't want the trees, why should he have to pay? Eventually, Rav saw that the owner of the field had fenced in the field and was safeguarding the trees. So he came around that it's good to have the trees. Rav said to him, by doing so, you have demonstrated your opinion that having these trees in your field is satisfactory to you. Therefore, I rule that you should go and have the court appraise both the expenses for the one who planted the trees and the value of the improvements. And now he has the advantage. You are obligated to pay him the greater of the two amounts because you didn't accept my ruling in the first place when you would have had to pay the lesser of the two amounts. Now you pay the greater. An Amoraic dispute was stated with regard to one who entered another's ruin. right? A ruin, like an old house that has fallen down. And it was abandoned, right? It was an abandoned house. Nobody was living there. It had fallen into ruin. So somebody, the squatter, went in and he built it up using his own materials, but he did so without the landowner's permission. And then later, the builder said to the landowner, I will dismantle the structure and take my timber and stones back. Presumably the landowner said, what are you doing here? This is my land. And then the builder said, okay, fine, it's your land, but what I improved, I'm taking it down. You're not going to get the benefit of the work that I did. Rav Nachman says that the court listens to him and the builder is allowed to dismantle what he built and take it away. Rav Sheshes says the court does not listen to him and he is not allowed to dismantle that which he built. So the Gemara raises an objection to Rav Nachman's ruling from a Baraisa, in the Tosefta of Bava, 10:6, about the same case. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, Beis Shammai say that the court listens to him, and Beis Hillel say that the court does not listen to him. And the Gemara explains the difficulty. Shall we say that Rav Nachman said his ruling in accordance with the opinion of Beis Shammai? That is untenable, as this is not listed as one of the specific exceptions to the principle that the law always is in accordance to Beis Hillel in their disputes with Beis Shammai. So the Gemara answers, Rav Nachman states his opinion in accordance with the opinion of that Tana, meaning Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, as it is taught in a Baraisa, according to both Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, the court listens to the one who wants to dismantle the improvements that he made without permission. And this is the statement of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, Beis Shammai say that the court listens to him, and Beis Hillel say that the court does not listen to him. So the Gemara inquires, what halachic conclusion, what was the legal conclusion in this matter? And Rav Yaakov said that Rabbi Yochanan said, in the case of a house, the court listens to him. But in the case of a field, the court does not listen to him. Right? So somebody who built up a house over a ruin, and then the landowner comes back and says, you have to leave. And the guy who built up the house says, well, then I'm going to tear down the house that I built and take the materials with me. That we allow that the squatter to dismantle the house and take it away. And we allow that in the case of a house. But we don't allow that in the case of a field. So presumably there, what we're talking about is a field that was abandoned. Somebody came in and started farming it or growing trees in it as an orchard. And then the landowner comes back and he says, hey, I'm back. You need to leave. And now the squatter says, okay, fine. Well, I'm going to, take down all the produce that I planted or chop down all the trees that I planted there. And the court does not listen to him. We do not allow him to tear down, to take away the produce or to cut down the trees that he planted there. So we don't do that. We do it for the case of a house. We don't do it in the case of a field. So the Gemara says, okay, in the case of a field, what is the reason that the court does not listen to the squatter who wants to take away what he planted? And it is due to the desire to promote the settling of the Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, because it is inappropriate to uproot trees. And there are those who say that it is for a different reason. It is due to the weakening of the land already caused by the tree roots, as it made the land unsuitable for other uses. Therefore, the owner of the trees may not just take them and leave the land in its worsened condition. And the Gemara asks, what is the practical difference between these two reasons? And the practical difference between them is whether outside of the land of Israel, the one who planted the trees may uproot them. If we're promoting the settling of the land of Israel, well, that reason only applies within Israel. So if this happened, between two Jews, but outside of Israel, there would be no reason to prohibit the squatter from taking away his trees, because we're only promoting the settling of the land of Israel in Israel. If, on the other hand, the reason that we don't let him take away the trees is because he weakened the ground by letting tree roots grow here, and if he uproots that, it's going to leave a mess behind for the landowner who now wants to, step in and reclaim his land. That's his. Then we wouldn't listen to him outside of Israel either. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 5. We are on page 101b. Here's Mishnah number 6. In the case of one who rents out a house in a town to another person in the rainy season, the owner cannot evict the renter from the house from the festival of Sukkot in the fall until Passover in the spring. If the rental was in the summer, which is the rainy season, right? The fall and winter is the rainy season. If the rental was in the summer, he must give 30 days notice before he can evict him. And for a house located in the cities, both in the summer and in the rainy season, he must give 12 months notice. Nice renter's rights. And for shops that a person rented out, both in towns and in cities, he must give 12 months notice. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, the minority opinion presumably, for a baker's shop or a dyer's shop, the owner of the land, the owner of the shop who's renting it out, must give 3 years notice to the tenant before he can evict him. That's Mishnah number 6. And the Gemara asks, what is different about the rainy season that one cannot evict his renter? And the Gemara suggests because when a person rents a house during the rainy season, it is presumed that he rents it for the entire rainy season. And the Gemara challenges this, but in the summer as well, the same law should apply because when a person rents a house, he rents it for the entire summer. And the Gemara offers a different explanation. Rather, in the rainy season, this is the reason that he cannot evict him. It is because at that time, houses for renting are not found on the market. Since alternative housing is not available, even if he is renting the house month by month, one cannot evict him because the guy will be homeless. And the Gemara asks, if that is the reason for the first clause of the Mishnah, say and try to explain accordingly the latter clause that states, and for a house located in the cities, both in the summer and in the rainy season, one must give 12 months notice. So it arises from this ruling that if the 12-month rental period would be completed during the rainy season, he could evict him then. But why is this acceptable given that houses for renting are not found on the market at that time? Given this difficulty, the Gemara offers a different interpretation of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda said, the Mishnah teaches about the requirement to give notice before eviction, and this is what it is saying. Rav Yehuda said, I'm sorry, that's what he just said. So Rav Yehuda is saying this. Although, in general, in the case of one who rents out a house to another, without specification of when the rental period will end, both the landlord and the renter can end the rental whenever they decide. Even so, the landlord cannot evict the renter during the rainy season, i.e. from Sukkot to Passover, unless he gives him notice of 30 days from the outset, i.e. before the rainy season begins. Since it would still be summer, it would be possible for the renter to find alternate housing. But if a fixed rental period was agreed upon, then the renter may be evicted upon its completion without prior notice. All right, so once again, we see where the parties did not specify the terms of their agreement, the sages step in and provide the law, under Torah law and rabbinic law, what should be the requirements. But they could have specified otherwise. It's just that they were silent on the matter at the time they entered into the agreement. And this is also taught in a Baraisa. When they said in the Mishnah, 30 days, and when they said 12 months, they said it only with regard to the requirements to give notice before eviction. And just as the landlord needs to give notice to his renter before he evicts him, so too a renter needs to give notice to his landlord before he can terminate the rental. And the Gemara explains why the renter must give notice, as the landlord can say to him, had you given me notice, I would have exerted myself to find and settle a respectable person in my house. Now that you left me in the lurch, I can't find someone because no other houses are on the market, so people aren't looking. Rav Asi says, if one day of the rental enters into the rainy season without notice being given, then the landlord cannot evict the renter from Sukkot until Pesach. And the Gemara challenges this, but didn't we say that he must be given 30 days notice? And Rav Asi's ruling indicates that if notice was given even a day before Sukkot, that would be sufficient. So the Gemara explains, this is what Rav Asi is saying. If one day of these 30 days of notice enters into the rainy season without notice being given, i.e. if notice was given fewer than 30 days before Sukkot, then the landlord cannot evict the renter from Sukkot until Pesach. Rav Huna said, and if the landlord comes to increase the rental fee, he may increase it without prior notice. Rav Nachman said to him, one who does so is like this person who grabbed another by his testicles so that he would relinquish his cloak, i.e., he has not provided the person with a true choice. By increasing the rent, one is effectively evicting him, and so he should have to give 30 days notice. But the Gemara defends Rav Huna's opinion that he doesn't have to give notice for raising the rent. No, the ruling is necessary in a case where the rental of houses become more expensive. Since the landlord would lose out by preserving the rent, it is acceptable for him to increase the rent without prior notice if that is what the market is doing. It is obvious that if the house in which the landlord lives fell down, then he can evict the renter from the house that he is renting to him without giving notice, as he can say to him, well, you are no better than me. Since the landlord needs to find a new house to live in, he can demand that he should move into his own rental property, and it should be the renter who must look for new housing. He cannot be expected to have given notice, as he could not have foreseen that his house would fall down. So sadly, there was a calamity here, a house fell down, but since the owner of the house also owns a separate property, he can move in there, and ultimately it's the renter who's out of luck. If a landlord sold the rental property to another, or bequeathed it to his heirs, or gave it to another person as a gift, the renter can say to the new owner, you are no better than the person from whom your ownership of the property came. Since he was required to give me notice before evicting me, so must you. And if a landlord marries off his son and wishes to evict his current renter to provide a home for the newly married couple, then we see, meaning it depends. If it was possible for him to have given notice as the couple had already been engaged for some time, then he is required to give notice and cannot evict the renter otherwise. But if it was not possible to give timely notice, shotgun wedding, then he can say to the renter, you are no better than me and my needs. I need the property now for my son. So it should be you who should go and find alternative housing. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara relates, incident. There was a certain man who purchased a boat laden with wine, and he was unable to find a place to store it. So he said to a certain woman, do you have a place to rent to me? She said to him, no. He was aware that she did own a suitable place, so he went and betrothed her. And then she gave him a lease on the place for him to bring in his wine there. So he went back to his home and he wrote a bill of divorce for her, which he then sent to her. Upon receiving the bill of divorce and realizing that the betrothal had been nothing more than a ruse, she went and hired porters, paying them from the wine itself, and instructed them to take the wine out of her place and put it on the road. Upon being presented with this case, Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, said, paraphrasing Obadiah 1:15, like he did, so shall be done to him. His repayment shall come back on his head. She was entitled to do as she did. And the Gemara explains Rav Huna's ruling. It is not necessary to state that the woman is entitled to evict the man if the place that she rented out to him was a courtyard that did not stand to be rented out, in which case she is not expected to rent it to anyone. Rather, even if it was a courtyard that stands to be rented out, she could say to him, it is amenable for me to rent the place to everyone else, but it is not amenable to me to rent it to you, as you are to me like a preying lion. Preying, a preying lion. Since you deceive me, I do not wish to have any dealings with you. And that was her right, and that's how Rav Huna ruled. And the Mishna taught, back to our Mishnah number 6, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, for a baker's shop or a dyer's shop, the owner must give 3 years' notice before evicting the tenant. And it was taught in a baraisa, the need for this unusually long period of notice is due to the fact that the length of credit extended by these businesses to their customers is extensive. They must be provided with enough time to collect their debts before being forced to relocate. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 6. God willing, tomorrow, Monday, we'll pick it up at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, with Mishnah number 7 here in chapter 8. I see a couple of questions. Sharon, can they plant the vegetables in the midst of the olive trees and not have the issue of mixed kinds? Very good. I wonder why. I mean, I think that we know that grain in a vineyard, no good. But I think that an orchard, right, whether it's lemon trees, apple trees, or even olive trees, you can plant vegetables among the trees. It's not kilayim. I'm not sure why, but that's my recollection. Karen, I don't see why tithing would be considered a penalty. Isn't tithing a mitzvah? Just because a Roman soldier stole your land, why should you be deprived of the consolation of the mitzvah? Beautiful. Beautiful. I mean, it costs you money, but you're absolutely right. You get to participate in tithing, to passing it along to the Levite, etc. I guess, maybe these are subsistence farmers and giving away 2% to a priest and 10% to a Levite. I don't know if at this period in history they're still having Meiser Sheni, because maybe the temple's probably gone at this time. So it might be difficult for him, but I think that's a really beautiful way to look at it. Listen, tithing is only a percentage, and no matter how little, even the Levite who lives off tithes has to tithe 10% to the Cohen, to the priest. And so you're absolutely right? The obligation that we have to participate in a mitzvah is not a penalty, right? It's to uplift us. It's a joy. It's a gift. Extending in a situation where he really wouldn't be commanded under Torah law, but he is commanded under rabbinic law as a matter of policy to try to get him to repurchase the land, if at all possible, is why they characterized it as a penalty. But I like the way you're interpreting that. Very good. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday at 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night.